What would you expect if you were to ask a random stranger to name for you a classic video game console? Obviously, given its legendary status, I would think that the NES or even just the broad term of a Nintendo would be the most common response you would get. However, I'm willing to bet if you were to follow up with, no, I'm looking for something even more vintage than that, you would most likely be referred to the equally iconic Atari 2600. There's no denying how massively successful the VCS was during the second generation of video game consoles, but of course, this little wood grain wedge wasn't your only option during this time. This is one of my favorite eras to collect for. It really was the Wild West of electronic gaming, and I love seeing what each machine brought to the market during this period of technology that was advancing at a monumental rate. However, it might surprise you to learn what my favorite game console from this generation is. Yes, of course it's the Vectrex, because how could anything ever compete with how cool this thing is? But for the sake of something else that's interesting to look at, let's pretend the Vectrex doesn't exist for a moment and take a look at my runner-up. This sleek silver machine here is the Odyssey², originally released by Magnavox in September of 1978. Some of you fine folks across the pond might also know this as the VideoPack G7000 by Philips. And I'm really fond of this thing, and to me, it seems like it doesn't get as much love as it deserves. So today I'm going to share with you the things that I really enjoy about this console. So for a bit of history, the Odyssey² is the cumulative result of a long line of consoles produced by Magnavox bearing the Odyssey name. Starting, of course, with the original Odyssey released in 1972, Magnavox would then go on to release a long line of home consoles under this name throughout the mid-1970s. These all would have been released during what could be called the Pong craze, which many other manufacturers were releasing dedicated machines for playing Pong and other similar electronic sports games at home, such as APF's line of TV Fun consoles and, of course, the official Pong machines from Atari themselves. After the release of Atari's VCS in 1977, Magnavox finally released their first cartridge-based home console with the Odyssey² the following year. While initially performing relatively well on the market for the first few years, albeit still trailing the much more successful VCS in sales, it wasn't until the release of the much more powerful Intellivision by Mattel in 1980, followed by Atari's 5200 and the ColecoVision in 1982, where the public's interest in the Odyssey² just completely vaporized. Being one of the casualties of the video game crash of 1983, the Odyssey² finished its run having sold around 2 million units. To put it into automotive terms, if Atari was GM and Mattel and Coleco were Chrysler and Ford, Magnavox with their Odyssey² were essentially American Motors among all of the competition. But just like AMC back in the day, Magnavox did attempt some rather impressive concepts with their products that were quite interesting compared to what their rivals were producing. The most obvious feature of this silver machine would be the membrane keyboard built into the Odyssey². Magnavox was wise to notice the beginnings of the personal computer market with the release of the Commodore PET, the Apple II, and the TRS-80 the year prior, and decided to include the keyboard with their console to bolster the capabilities of their machine and hopefully tap into this market. Indeed, quite a bit of software was released for the Odyssey² which utilized the keyboard, with some titles featuring variations of Hangman or other word guessing games. And there was also some educational software and even a computer programming cartridge released that made full use of this keyboard. One of my favorite ways the keyboard was utilized would be in the game KC Munchkin, which, in case you couldn't tell, was Magnavox's rather obvious clone of Namco's famous dot-gobbling yellow pizza. Apart from the built-in mazes available with the game, you even had the ability to create your own through the use of this keyboard. This feature alone adds a massive amount of replay value to the game and is really fun to mess around with. For the controllers, Magnavox mimicked the classic joystick design already in use by Atari on their VCS, with the classic directional stick and the single action button. Early Odyssey² would feature these silver controllers, while the later revisions would see black controllers with a revised joystick opening. Uniquely, it is these earlier silver controllers that were detachable from the console via a 9-pin socket, with the later black ones being hardwired directly to the machine. The software library itself contains the typical mix of games you would expect from this era, oftentimes sharing similarities with games being released by the competition. You will see your usual tank shooters, racing games, sports simulations, and of course, a plethora of space adventure titles to enjoy on the Odyssey 2. Some of the more direct clones will be games like the aforementioned Casey Munchkin and its sequel, Casey's Wild Chase, both being derivatives of Pac-Man with a bit of Atari Centipede thrown in for the latter. UFO is, of course, inspired by Asteroids. Freedom Fighters kinda sorta plays like Defender. Alien Invaders Plus is essentially Space Invaders. Blockout is Breakout. You get the picture. Now, the graphics and sound that the Odyssey 2 is able to generate does tend to be a bit more on the primitive side compared to its rivals, especially once the Intellivision and the Colecovision made it to market. In particular, the more you spend time with the Odyssey 2, the more you realize that many of the games appear to use the same assets for the graphics. In fact, this was due to a limitation of the console itself. The BIOS of the Odyssey 2 contains a pre-programmed set of 64 different sprites which any game cartridge has access to, along with only 4 sprites which can be defined by the game ROM itself. Due to this, you can often see the creative ways in which the programmers utilize these sprites across multiple games. Granted, this limitation ended up being a major detriment to the Odyssey 2 as the technology of the competition improved. However, I actually think that it lends itself well to the overall charm of the console. While, of course, there are some duds in the library, Odyssey 2 games tend to be really fun and action-packed. Many games have this chaotic feel to them with a bunch of vibrant flashing colors and bursts of sound. The fact that a lot of the graphics and sound tends to be similar across multiple titles sort of creates a unique aesthetic to the console. Hell, just take a look at the insanely dynamic box art for the games and the console itself. Magnavox really knocked it out of the park with their graphic design for this machine. It's easily one of my favorite design languages for really any video game console. Now, beyond just the standard game cartridges here, Magnavox even used their console to experiment with hybrid board games, one of which I actually have here. The Quest for the Rings is an adventure game which takes inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons and The Lord of the Rings. Along with the cartridge itself, you get an assortment of tokens, an instruction booklet, a physical playboard, and even an overlay that fits neatly over the console's keyboard. Upon release, The Quest for the Rings was lauded by critics who praised the game's innovation and blending of a traditional board game with modern electronic games. The Odyssey 2 even received its own speech synthesis module, aptly named The Voice. This module attached to the top of the console and had its own cartridge slot, much akin to other pass-through devices like the Power Base Converter or 32X modules for the later Sega Genesis. By connecting a compatible game to The Voice, the module would then produce its own speech and sound effects to complement the audio generated by the Odyssey 2. To demonstrate, here are some of the games I own which are compatible with the unit. We have P.T. Barnum's Acrobats.
Look out! Incredible!
Casey's Crazy Chase.
Watch out! Hurry! Watch out! Incredible!
Turtles. Killer Bees. Smithereens.
That's easy.
And, of course, included with the voice module itself came a special text-to-speech cartridge where you can actually program your own words and phrases into the Odyssey 2, and it will say the text that you entered.
Welcome to Steve's Assorted Stuff.
All in all, I think the module does a pretty impressive job, at least a bit better than what the much more widely known IntelliVoice module for the Intellivision was capable of, but I'll let you be the judge of that.
Mattel Electronics presents 317 Bomber.
but perhaps my favorite game that is compatible with the voice, and really probably my favorite game on the Odyssey 2 in general, would have to be Attack of the Time Lord. The gameplay is really chaotic, with you controlling a flak cannon tasked with shooting down a swarm of invading saucers that dart randomly across the screen. With each wave that you defeat, the enemies become faster and more erratic, and begin introducing more dangerous weapons to use against you. Apart from the intensely fun gameplay, the icing on the cake would be the mini cutscenes that happen between levels and upon your death. If you have the voice module installed, the alien leader will pop up on screen and actually taunt you before the start of the next round.
Prepare for defeat. Defend your world. Destroy the Earthling. Defeat is at hand.
Even cooler is that on later levels, your opponent will actually compliment your efforts as well.
Not bad, human. A commendable defense.
If you have interest in picking up an Odyssey 2 for yourself, Attack of the Time Lord is easily a must-own title for the console. I highly, highly recommend it. And lastly, I want to touch on one of the other great things about the Odyssey 2, being that it is a very affordable video game console to collect for. The consoles themselves can easily be found for under $100, and the vast majority of the games in its library are pretty inexpensive. I personally own 33 of the 47 games officially released for the console in my collection, and given how affordable this machine and its software is, I would think that the Odyssey 2 would have to be one of the cheapest game consoles to attain a complete library for it. And so, that concludes our look at the Magnavox Odyssey 2. I really love this thing. Again, I find this console incredibly charming, and I think the programmers responsible for the console's library of games did an excellent job creating some exciting software despite the tough hardware limitations. Combine this with some of the really innovative concepts that Magnavox attempted with their machine, and I think this all makes for a really interesting piece of video gaming history. I've been wanting to give the Odyssey 2 the love that it is due for quite a while now, since, in my opinion, I feel as though it doesn't get the same attention that its competition did. From how little mentioned it is, you would think that the Odyssey 2 is as obscure as, say, like the Channel F or the Astrocade. But hopefully my thrusting it into the limelight for a bit through a video on my channel helps get the word out there that these things are really fun and are worthy to take a look at. And as always, I thank you for joining me. I hope to see you next time. And until then, have a great day. Well, I'm done filming, but hey, Daisy, psst, psst, psst. Are you going to help me clean this up? Yeah, all this stuff. Yep, I didn't think so.